Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. This is Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We are in the seventh week of the course and I'll continue to talk to you about language comprehension. Let's talk about the role of context in word recognition. In the last lecture, we talked in some detail about uh, spoken word comprehension. We talked in some detail about written word comprehension, but we've not really talked in any detail about the role of context in word recognition. See, why is context important? Context is important basically because we do not really read words in isolation, or we do not really hear words in isolation. We typically read them or hear them as part of the larger narrative, as part of the larger conversation, maybe some kind of text I'm reading, or I'm having a conversation with somebody, or I'm listening to a program, podcast, or something, and so on. So, understanding the meaning of the word is not really an exercise in isolation. Typically, words are understood in the context of other words. Okay, so what the readers or listeners need to do is they need to retrieve the syntactic and semantic information about these words and be able to integrate the syntactic and semantic properties of the recognized words into a representation of the whole utterance. Say, for example, let's talk about an example of a word that can have several meanings. Basically, what meaning of that word, say for example, synonyms, what meaning of that word is being used in a given context needs to be understood in the reference of that context itself. We'll come to this in a bit. Now, several questions can therefore be posed to understand the role of context in the comprehension of words' meaning. For instance, how does the linguistic and non-linguistic context influence word processing? Or is it possible to retrieve word meanings before the words are seen, or when the word meanings are highly predictable in a given context? Finally, somebody could ask whether context influences word processing before or after lexical access, and whether lexical selection influences are complete. Say, for example, that if you've made a lexical selection, only the meaning of the word that is appropriate to the context is going to come up. Let's take an example of this sentence. The tall man planted a tree on the bank. Now, here the word bank can mean both a financial institution or the side of the river. Now, the semantic integration of the final word bank into the context of this overall sentence uh, allows us, or say, let us say, biases us to interpret the meaning in terms of the side of the river and not as a financial institution. However, let us say there are so many beautification projects, etc., that keep on happening in our cities. Maybe there is some beautification going on, let us say, of a particular bank, and there is some place in the city next to the bank where trees can be planted. So it basically it has to the understanding of the meaning of a particular word really needs to go in consonance with the overall context. For 90% of the times in this sentence you will basically be biased to understanding the meaning of the word bank as side of the river, because that is more usually the place where people plant trees. Now, in this context, several important questions can be raised. See, for example, whether the sentence's context influences the activation of multiple meanings of the word bank. Say, for example, the tall man planted a tree on the bank. Will this activate both the meanings of the word bank, or it will just activate one given meaning? Okay. Also, we can ask, for example, things like, do contextually appropriate meaning of the word bank and the contextually inappropriate meaning of the word bank in this here become, both of them become briefly activated regardless of the context of the sentence? Or finally, we can ask the question is that, does the context sentence context immediately constrain the activation to the contextually appropriate meaning of the word bank, so that the other meaning, that of the financial institution, does not get activated at all? Now, here you can take a bit of a pause and just try and understand what are the questions that I'm asking. First is that, does the context of the sentence, the tall man planted a tree, have any role to play in the activation of the meaning of this word ban? Okay. Now, if it has a role to play, does it constrain the activation to just activating the meaning of the word bank, that is basically the side of the river, and the other meaning, that is basically this the financial institution part, does not really get activated at all. Okay, the other thing could be that, say, for example, irrespective of the context of the sentence, because we know this word, both the meanings of this word, of the word, basically the financial institution and that meaning of the side of the river, both of them will get activated regardless. Okay, so you have to sort of, just delve into your experiences, see what typically happens. Now, if we look closely, there are at least two types of representations that. Now, there are three types of models that we can consider. Okay, modular models. See, modular models basically are referred to as more autonomous models, and these models actually claim that normal language comprehension is executed within separate and independent modules. Okay, so language comprehension is separate from all other kinds of cognitive activity, and it is done in a separate module that has nothing to do with the sensory processing, etc. Okay. So what this model actually says is that higher level representations, conceptual representations, basically will not have a chance to influence the lower level representations, and therefore the flow of information is strictly from bottom upwards. Okay. Now there are other kinds of models, interactive models. Interactive models are models that maintain that all types of information can participate in vertical cognition. So broad information, conceptual level information, and also sensory information. Now, according to these kind of models, context can have its influence. Sometimes, according to these models, context can have its influence even before the sensory information is available by changing the activational status of the word form representations in the mental lexicon. What does this mean? Suppose because of this, because of I was already talking about my village and I was already talking about the river and the village. What this will do is this will automatically preclude any other possible meaning that can be activated. So your attention will not even go on the second probable meaning. It will just focus and it will only be there to activate the first meaning, which is the side of the river. Then there are other kinds of models that are referred to as the hybrid models. Now, these hybrid models basically are models wherein information about word forms that are possible given the preceding context there is basically activated. Okay, so it basically reduces the number of activated candidates. It's similar to the interactive part, but that one was taking both higher and lower information. In the hybrid models, information from about word forms basically that are possible is activated. So every other thing that is not congruent to the context will not get activated at all. Now there was a study conducted to contrast the usefulness of the modular versus the interactive models, and this was done by Zwitserlund in 1989, involving a lexical decision task. If you remember, the lexical decision task is where you are presented with words and you are asked whether this given stimulus is a meaningful word or it is not. Now, the participants were asked to listen to short texts such as with dampened spirits, the men stood around the grave. They mourned the loss of their captain. Okay, so this is a short text which these people will be asked to listen to. At different points during the auditory representation of the word captain, a visual target was presented. Okay, so this target stimulus could either be related to the actual word captain. If, for example, an auditory competitor like the word capital. Uh, so in the current example, the target words could be ship, that is related to the word, or money, that is related to the word capital. In other cases, a pseudo word could be presented. Now, participants in this task were asked to decide whether the presented target word was actually a word or not. So, lexical decision task. Now, the results showed that the participants were faster to decide whether ship was a word or not, given the context of the sentence, and were slow to decide whether money was a word or not. Okay, so basically, this is what is happening. They presented, they could decide whether ship was a word or not, given the context of the thing, because obviously they were thinking of a ship's captain. but they could not decide whether money was a word or not, or they were faster to decide. It's not that they are not able to perform this, but there are minute differences in the timing that we are basically counting upon. Okay, so they were slightly slower in deciding whether money was a word or not. So it seems here, if you look at this experiment in some detail, it seems therefore that the lexical selection process is influenced by the contextual information that is available from the text, and that the participants had heard before the whole word captain was spoken. So because this whole preface has been given, because this whole short text has been given, they are already partially activating the word for captain, and that is probably allowing them to identify that word slightly faster as opposed to any other word. Now, this finding is consistent with the idea that lexical selection can be influenced by the sentence context. More evidence also points out in the same direction that suggests that at least lexical selection is influenced by higher level contextual information. So, some experiments were done in this regard by William Marsland Wilson and their colleagues, Zhuang in paper Zhuang and colleagues 2011, basically involving fMRI studies of word recognition, and actually they showed that the process of lexical access and lexical selection involve a network that includes the middle temporal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, and the ventral inferior and bilateral dorsal inferior frontal gyri. They also demonstrated that the middle temporal gyrus and the superior temporal gyrus are important for the translation of words or translation of speech sounds to word meanings. Also, the frontal cortex regions were found to be important in the selection process, and a greater involvement of the dorsal inferior frontal gyri was occurred when selection required choosing the actual word from many lexical candidates. So lexical selection appears to involve the dorsal inferior frontal gyrus. Let's talk a little bit about integration of words in sentences. Now, language comprehension is supposed to require individuals to not just understand the meanings of isolated words, but also understand the overall message. What is being said? What is the point of this whole conversation? Now, an important aspect of trying to understand a message involves integrating the semantic and syntactic properties of the recognized words into a representation of the overall utterance or the larger utterance or the message. So, let us say if we take the last sentence into consideration again, I'm reading it out. With dampened spirits, the men stood around the grave. They mourned the loss of their captain. Now, in order to understand the correct meaning of the sentence and the correct interpretation of the word bank, we need to quickly integrate the meaning of this word bank to the overall, overall context. Now, higher order semantic processing is actually required to determine the correct sense or meaning of the word in the context of a given sentence, especially when the word may have more than one possible meaning. So, okay. Now, in addition, the semantic information about words is just not enough to understand the overall message, and therefore, a syntactic analysis of the sentence is needed. This syntactic analysis of the sentence will reveal its structure and the information about what is the actor, what is the object, the theme, or the action in the sentence. Say, for example, the little old lady bites the gigantic dog. Okay, the syntactic analysis of the sentence reveals that who was the actor, the little old lady, what was the theme, biting is the theme or the action, and what was the subject, the dog is the subject. Indeed, the syntactic analysis can continue even in the absence of real meaning, because obviously the real meaning of the sentence is highly improbable. In several studies, normal participants have been shown to detect a target word in a sentence even when the sentence does not make any sense but is grammatically correct. So people are faster at doing this than when they are asked to detect a target word in a sentence that is grammatically disrupted. So if grammar is there, then people perform slightly better in this word target word detection tasks. Now, how do we process sentence structure? When we hear or read sentences, it is assumed that we activate word forms that in turn activate the grammatical and semantic information about these word forms in the mental lexicon. It seems that the representations of whole sentences may not be stored in the mental lexicon. Rather, what probably happens is that the brain assigns a structure to the words that are being activated in a sentence through a process called syntactic parsing. More specifically, syntactic parsing is a process where the structures of sentences is incrementally built rather than retrieved. Let's talk about semantic processing and the N400. Now, Kutas and Hilliard in 1980 described an ERP component that is related to linguistic processing. So, this ERP component had a negative polarity voltage peak in brain waves that actually reaches around the maximum amplitude at about 400 milliseconds after the onset of the word stimulus that evoked it, termed as the N400 response. The N400 is especially sensitive to the semantic aspects of the linguistic input and can be elicited in at least three kinds of situations. When sentences end with a word congruent with the preceding context, such as it was his first day at work, or when sentences end with a word that is anomalous to the preceding context, say for example, he spread the warm bread with socks. The third is when sentences end with a word that is semantically congruent with the preceding context but physically slightly deviant. Say, for example, she puts on her high heeled shoes. Here, the word shoes is printed in uppercase. The words preceding the word shoes are all in lowercase, and therefore it is physically deviant, and therefore it might elicit an N400 response. Now, these sentences were presented to participants on a computer screen, one word at a time. They were asked to read the sentences attentively with the knowledge that questions may be asked at the end of the experiment. The EEGs were averaged for the sentence in each for the sentences in each condition by averaging the data for the last words of the sentences separately for each kind of sentence. When a sentence would end up with an anomalous word or the amplitude of N400 was found to be greater than when participants read congruent words. Okay. The difference in amplitude is referred to as the N400 effect. Okay. Now, on the other hand, words that were semantically congruent with the sentence but were merely physically deviant elicited a positive potential rather than an N400. So, it did not really increase the N400. Also, subsequent experiments have demonstrated that non-semantic deviations like musical or grammatical violations also do not elicit the N400. So, it was established that N400 is typically tied to semantic analysis, or in simpler words, when there is a semantic anomaly, when there is a meaning anomaly in a given sentence. Now, this N400 response has also been found to be sensitive to the comprehension of languages that goes beyond single sentences. Okay, so for example, in an experiment done by von Berkim and colleagues, it was shown that an N400 response could also be elicited to words that were inconsistent with the meaning of the entire story and not just of that sentence. For example, in a story about a man who had become vegetarian, the last sentence was he went to a restaurant and ate a steak that was prepared well. Okay. Now, because this the whole story is about how this person became vegetarian, what were the troubles, etc., and then the last sentence ends by this particular sentence that he went to a restaurant and ate a steak. Steak is a non-vegetarian food, and therefore N400 will be activated here because this last sentence is inconsistent with the overall message of the story. Now here the sentence, you could already, I'm sure you see that the sentence is completely fine both in terms of semantics and syntax is also correct, but the word steak, because it is inconsistent with the overall context of the story, elicits the N400 effect. Syntactic processing and this P600 review. Let's talk a little bit about the syntactic processing aspects. Now, another ERP component was reported by Osterhout and Holcomb in 1992 and is referred to as the syntactic positive shift, or SPS, or the P600. This ERP component was observed at about 600 milliseconds after the onset of the words that were incongruous with the expected syntactical structure. Okay, so for example, if you come across sentences like drunk gets 9 months in violent case, or enraged cows injures farmer with an axe. Okay, so both of these sentences syntactically are creating ambiguities. Okay, Hagood Brown and colleagues asked their participants to silently read these sentences presented to them one word at a time on a monitor. Brain responses to normal sentences were contrasted with brain responses to sentences that contain a grammatical violation. What they observed was a large positive shift that was elicited approximately around 600 milliseconds after the onset of the violating word. The P600 effect also shows up in response to a number of other kinds of syntactic violations, and it is elicited both when participants are reading or hearing the sentences. This effect has also been validated in several different languages. Now, finally, Cooperberg and colleagues 2003 and 7 have shown that the P600 response can also be evoked by a semantic violation in the absence of any syntactic violations. Say, for example, if there is a semantic violation between a verb and its subject, but the syntax is correct, you can still see the P600 effect. Say, for example, the eggs would eat toast with jam in breakfast. Now, syntactically, everything is alright, but semantically, there is a violation because we know that eggs are not capable of eating. Okay, so such sentences may exhibit a P600 response, because even as the syntactic answer of the sentence is challenged by the semantic relations of words in the sentence. So basically, uh, it is like the system is surprised as how eggs are coming as the subject of the sentence but not with the not at its rightful place as the object of the sentence. Syntactic processing is also reflected in other types of brain waves as well. For example, Thomas Munthe and colleagues and Friedrichi and colleagues have described a negative wave over the left frontal areas of the brain, and this is basically referred to as the left anterior negativity or the LAN. It is typically observed when words violate word category in a given sentence. For example, as in the red eats. Now, the red cats is more, or red cars is more suitable here as opposed to the word red eats. Now, here basically a noun was expected instead of a verb, and therefore this violation will lead to eliciting the left anterior negativity. Now, LAN arises at about the same time as the N400, but it has a different voltage distribution over the scalp. Some brain damage patients have actually been shown to have severe difficulty in producing sentences and understanding complex sentences. These kind of deficits are common in patients who have agrammatic aphasia and who generally produce 2 or 3 word sentences consisting exclusively of content words and completely devoid of function words, the articles and prepositions, etc. Now, these patients have been shown to have difficulty in understanding complex syntactic structures. So, when these patients, let us say, if they hear a sentence like the gigantic dog was bitten by the little old lady, they'll most likely understand it to mean that the lady was bitten by the dog. Okay, because they will not really be able to understand that this is in passive form, this is the passive structure of sentence. So this kind of problem in assigning syntactic structure to sentences has often been associated with lesions that include the Broca's area in the left hemisphere, suggesting that the left inferior frontal cortex is involved in some kind of syntactic processing. Now, neuroimaging evidence from recent research by Kaplan and colleagues also offers some clues about syntactic processing in the brain. In some of their studies using PET methodology, participants were made to read sentences varying in syntactic complexity. Kaplan and colleagues found increased activation in the left inferior frontal cortex for the more complex syntactic structures. In other research, manipulations of sentence complexity have also led to activation of more than just the left inferior frontal cortex. For example, Just and colleagues in 1996 showed that activation in the Broca's area and Wernicke's area, also homologous areas in the right hemisphere, were observed when people were reading syntactically complex sentences. PET studies have identified portions of the anterior superior temporal gyrus as another candidate for syntactic processing, a finding that was confirmed later by Donkers and colleagues in the year 1994. All in all, you can say that it has now been established that syntactic processing occurs in the network of left inferior frontal and superior temporal brain regions that are activated during various aspects of language processing. I think this was all for this lecture. Thank you for listening.